You are now listening to The Jet Life Uncovered, an insightful podcast that explores the minds of those who have conquered to live a meaningful life in the air and on the ground. Whether you're a pilot, frequent flyer, or celebrity, we uncover the deep truths of what it's like to live life in and out of the jet. I'm your host, Fernando, airline pilot, personal trainer, and intervention coach. You're about to take off into a conversation with individuals in which we get to know their intersection between living a purposeful life and reaching peak performance. The Jet Life Uncovered podcast starts now. Today, we're with Kyle Freiburger, who is a pilot and also the founder of First Class Leaders, an amazing organization that's helped a ton of people increase their leadership skills. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Looking forward to a good conversation here.
Yeah, likewise. So I want to dive right into the aviation portion of it. You started when you were about 14, got your first license at 16. I mean, super young. Not a lot of people get to start that young. You've been a captain on a 7576, and now you are flying a Gulfstream. What was your experience like during all these years of aviation, and how did you get to want to start First Class Leaders?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and you're already kind of giving me that soft introduction, so I won't go over the whole backstory, but a little bit of my backstory is kind of relevant to what led me to where I am, because first and foremost, I'll just share that everything that I've created as far as First Class Leaders and got into First Class Leaders wise, it just all stems from my personal challenges and struggles, and realizing that I didn't have very good support. There wasn't much support for leadership soft skills, developing myself. So if I back up and you talk about, okay, I was flying airplanes when I was 14 by myself, and I graduated top of my class, and I had all these accolades. And I always preface my story with talking about that, because my first interview when I was 20, my first airline interview, I'd already been working a couple of bush jobs. My first airline interview when I was 22 or 23, I didn't get the job. And I was actually confused. I don't even know what any other emotion other than confusion, because every test, everything in school, everything in my flight testing and in my career, I had aced. So everything was telling me you're a great pilot. And so I ended up investing some money into how to interview. And I went on to interview for Air Canada, major airline up in Canada here. And I was 24 years old, and I told them what they needed to hear, and I fooled them, and they hired me. But so fast forward, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But fast forward, I got to about the age of 28, 29. I was in and out of different relationships, and I was going to becoming a captain there at Air Canada. I knew that was around the corner, and I was really just starting to challenge what I thought I knew. I was in some relationship with this girl who was a doctor, and she made lots of money, and I was making lots of money, yet we weren't happy. And that's just a story I tell, because that actually describes a lot of my relationships. And I ended up breaking up with her, and I luckily had the right person in my life at the right time, a mentor of mine who prompted me to read a couple of books and start looking at life a little differently. And I went on this path of personal development, emotional intelligence, soft skills, and realized I was missing out on a whole side of life that I never knew existed. The idea of connection, and the idea of understanding how to get along with other people and navigate conflict effectively, so that it was more of a place of curiosity as opposed to a place of judgment. Long story short, I went through about 6-7 years of this personal development journey, upgraded at Air Canada, and realized that nobody in my entire life had ever stopped me to say, hey, Kyle, you need to practice your soft skills. You need to learn how to be a leader. You need to learn how to develop your emotional intelligence. Nobody told me that. And so I became this captain, and I realized very quickly that the number one thing about being a captain on a commercial airliner is you have to be really good at dealing with people.
Absolutely.
And so they kind of set you up for, they set you up for not failure. We're very technically well trained, so we get away with it. But there is a whole side of aviation, and I think it's just humans in general. A lot of us are set up for a life of difficulty when we can't navigate conflict and stuff like that. So anyways, fast forward, I'm ranting. We started first class leaders to fill that need.
Wow,
That's
man.
why we exist.
Yeah, yeah. And great things stem from experiences like yours. And from just hearing this short part, it sounds like naturally you are a leader in with what you took from your experience in what you have accomplished with yourself. So when you mentioned that, you had such a great career in aviation, acing all the tests, being top of your class, and then you don't get that airline job. I mean, the fact that you've seeked out extra, that you knew that you needed some additional stuff, is already more than just feeling negative about yourself. So that's a form of leadership. When when you had this breakup with this girl that you were dating, you knew that you had other things to explore about yourself, and you went out of your way to know more about it, learn, and then now you took all that knowledge and you started what you so that to me is like natural leadership,
Man, I appreciate the kind words. It's funny because I can look back now and see that,
Yeah,
and I would agree with you, but I didn't know it then.
of course.
And so, part of me is like, well, are you a leader when you don't even know you're a leader? I think it's true. I think leadership is just influence. I don't think it's anything more or less. I think you can be a leader and not even know you're a leader.
Yeah,
And I actually think that's how most people operate. Because if you look at leadership as influence, we're always influencing people around us. It
of
could be
course.
positive, could be negative.
Yeah,
And when you look into leadership and you start to look inwards, you start to realize how to more positively influence people.
yeah.
And that to me is one of the skills that I got from I had a difficult childhood with a father who was verbally and physically abusive to a degree. It was kind of just that old school mentality. But one of the things it taught me was resilience, perseverance.
Mm-hmm.
So I never really got down on myself. I always thought, oh, I screwed that up. What do I learn? How do I keep going?
Right.
And that mentality, what I didn't realize was probably one of the defining factors in my career. And I've talked with a lot of student pilots, a lot of pilots in their careers with what we're doing. And it's sad to say there's a lot of pilots that give up because they've never dealt with that mentality, or they've never been taught how to persevere through failure, through challenge.
Yeah. And so to understand clearly what you said about your dad and that resilience, you were able to see a positive, even though the relationship wasn't the best, you were able to see a positive in which the way he was with you, you were able to be resilient and not be negative on yourself when you first failed that interview, correct? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be that part of that internal human feeling where we feel like we're not valued.
Sure.
Right. We have this survival instinct that we don't have to run from lions anymore. So we don't really have to survive that like life or death survive anymore from lions. It's fairly easy to survive nowadays, but we still attach like our internal value to our survival. And so what ends up happening is we have that, instinctive internal dialogue that says, hey, I'm not good enough, or, hey, I must not be a pilot because I can't, I failed this thing.
Yeah.
But I can tell you there's a lot of pilots that have failed a lot, at least somewhere in their career, there's something
Absolutely.
that they've had a challenge or a setback. And that's the point. Like, we're pushed to the limits to see what we're capable of, and then to learn to be even better. And to ever look at a pilot, or to ever look at somebody and think they're ever going to be perfect in any industry, right? We look at doctors like they're gods, or surgeons like they're perfect, but we're not. And one of the things in aviation that we promote is talking a little bit more about that side of how we're not perfect. And you're reminding me of a concept called the gap and the gain. And that's something that I didn't understand back then, but again, I can unpack it a little bit easier now and talk about it. But yes, one of the things I did really well, I'm proud of myself for doing, but again, I was unconsciously doing it, but I was always focused on the gain. I was always focused on what I've been able to do. And so this concept called the gap and the gain, I'll share it really quickly. I think your audience will appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's by Dan Sullivan. It's actually a book called The Gap and the Gain. It's the most simplistic concept, but when you listen to it, you realize like 99% of the population is actually self-destructing. Like we're actually really messing up ourselves because of the way that we're thinking about our goals and our successes.
Yeah.
So I'll share the concept. So basically, most people, and if you're listening to this, just, lean in and think about it. It's okay, because most people think this way. But most people look at.
By the way, when you explained this in another podcast, I did exactly what you just said. I leaned in, and man, I was taken away by it. And I'm really glad that you're going to elaborate on this.
Yeah, man. And if as I go through it, just ask me any questions to bring clarity as well, just so everybody here listening gets absolute clarity on this, because it's a game changer. It's an absolute game changer. So most people, we set goals in the future, right? We're even, society teaches us to set goals, and this definition of success is somewhere in the future. So for an example, at one point I could not drive a car, and I had a goal to drive a car, right? I didn't have a license, wanted to have a license, or I couldn't fly an airplane at one point. It doesn't matter. You could take this a million different ways. So let's stick with the car analogy. At one point I couldn't drive a car, so all I wanted to do was drive this car. And I had to do everything to be able to drive a car. First, I had to get to the age, I had to pass a test, I had to pass a written test, a driving test, and then I was able to drive a car. So one day I was able to get to that car. As soon as I started driving that car, my goals moved. Then I'm like, okay, well, now I want to own a car, right? And I set it in the future again.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when we do this, when we set these goals this way, is we're constantly chasing. We're constantly setting a goal in the future, and it's always moving, right? You never get to a goal and then leave it there. You push that goal even further.
Right.
If you ever accomplish a goal. And then what's even worse is if you don't quite get to that goal, then you say to yourself, oh, I'm a failure. I didn't get there. I wasn't able to drive that car. I didn't get I failed my commercial flight test, or I failed this, or I failed that. And what happens is when you think that way, your mentality is frustration, failure, misery. It's very negative.
Mm-hmm.
And so the opposite side of that coin is operating in what we call the gain. So that's called the gap, when we're chasing a target in the future and we're trying to fill that gap. The opposite of that is the gain. The gain is saying, well, at one point you didn't have a car and you weren't able to drive a car, and now I can drive a car. And so what I have to practice, and we don't do this enough, and this is where gratitude comes from. This is where my understanding, I really started to understand leaning into gratitude. But when do you at what point in your day or what point in your life do you sit there and say, oh, wow, at one point I couldn't fly an airplane and now I can. Oh, wow, at one point I couldn't drive a car and now I can. At one point I couldn't walk and now I can.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you think about just listening to my voice and how I talk about that, my mentality is success.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm successful. I am successful. It's not I'm going to be successful. It's I am successful.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that's so important to understand those two different mentalities is not because it solves your problems, but who's going to have a better chance of solving your challenges? Which version of you? The person who's constantly frustrated, living in frustration and failure. Oh, I screwed this up. I failed that. I missed this check mark. I missed this goal. Or the person that's like, you know what? I missed that goal, but it's okay because look how much I did accomplish. You set a goal of calling 100 people in a day, or getting $100 in your bank account, and you get 99. So you say to yourself, either, oh crap, I'm one short, I failed, right? Or, wow, I got $99 in my bank account.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
You talk about a flight test, right? I got 60% on a flight test and I needed 70 to pass. What does everybody do? Oh my God, I failed. Right. I screwed all these different things up, as opposed to look at all the great things I did well.
Right.
I just need a little bit more time to work on these other things.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Yeah, and not to think about it in a way of, well, I knew 60% more than I knew before, so you should be content. No, it's kind of like a little bit of a help to the push to get you back up to the rest of that 40%, right? It's not a complacency kind of thinking. It's more of like, I've done this, and it's kind of like a booster to get you to the rest of it. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it's motivation, right?
Right.
It's the mentality. Like, you don't you don't accomplish anything new unless you form that mentality. It's
Yeah.
so difficult. Talk about
Yeah.
trying to become a pilot, trying to start a business. I mean, you've got a business, you're a pilot,
Right.
right? Like, what gets you through it? Like, how do you deal with a challenge or a setback? Have
Right.
you ever had a challenge or a setback?
Of course. All the
Right?
time.
Of course
All
we
the
have.
time. Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
And the majority of the times of where I deal with the setback is I reflect on how did I do it, right? Like I analyze, okay, did I prepare enough? Did I plan enough? Did I do anything enough? What can I do different? And that, what you said right there is the motivational part is just, okay, let's say I got a 60%. My motivation is how am I going to get the 40%? But the discipline in where I structure myself to get to that 40% is the success right there. You are learning about yourself there, and you're in this situation where you feel a certain way. How can I get to that end goal? And you find out things about yourself, things that you may not know you were capable of doing, or strengthening what you probably didn't use before in that 60%, but now you're using now in this 40% that you're trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
And that's just one of the plenty of different ways on dealing with setbacks.
Yeah. I mean, another great way of looking at it too is if you're climbing a mountain, right? The goal is the top of the mountain, but the process is the climb. And you
Exactly.
get two options. And most people, again, I'm not saying this in a negative way. It's honestly, it's biological. It's society teaches us. We're kind of sculpted into the way that we are. But the thing is once you realize it, if any of the stuff that we're talking about makes sense, and you're starting to realize, okay, maybe I am living in the gap a little too much, then you owe it to yourself to do something about it. And another great way of looking at it is if you're climbing a mountain, there's the process and there's the result, right? Success is at the top of the mountain. That's what a lot of people think. And that was used to be my definition of success, is getting to becoming an Air Canada captain.
Yep.
The problem is the more you think about the top of the mountain, the less you're turning around and looking at the beautiful view as it gets better and better as you're climbing.
Right.
So how do you want to live your life? Do you want to live your life taking a couple of steps, turning around, looking at the view? Right? Or do you want to live your life only thinking about the top of the mountain and trying to get there?
Right.
Which one's going to be more fulfilling?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Which one's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that totally reminds me of when we were hiking Mount Fuji. It was exactly that. My goal, okay, let's get to the top because we're going to get there, 12,000 or 13,000 feet, however long it is. And maybe like 3/4 of the way through, I catch cramps. And if I didn't catch that cramp where I needed a time to like just take a second to gather myself, and I turned around and I saw how beautiful the other side was. And then I was like, holy shit, man, this is a journey. This isn't just about getting to the top. And at that moment, I see someone passing me who was going way slower than I was. And I start chatting with that person and I'm like, hey, it's kind of tough getting up here, right? He's like, it's getting harder to breathe. And he's like, yeah, I know. This is my second day. I started from 0, sea level. I was like, holy shit, dude. We started at like 7,000. And this guy's been on this journey for 2 days. Now my mind's thinking of like, oh, how are we going to get to the, I'm not focused on getting to the top. I'm focused on how we're going to get to the top. Right. And, things came to me and where I did like a couple stretches, muscle activations for allowing me to, push through. And I did, man. And it became more about what's my experience getting up there rather than just being up there and say, I made it. It was way more fulfilling going through that experience, going through that journey. So that was a great metaphor, man. That was really good. Today's episode is brought to you by Garmin. If you're looking for the leader in technology for the best fitness watches out there, you gotta go with Garmin. I personally wear the D2 Mach 1 Pro when I'm sleeping, when I'm working out, when I'm flying, and when I'm out socially because it has such a great unique style to it, but also it has the athletic look and also the classy look as well. So I love being able to interchange the bands to pull off the look that I'm going for. It is super comfortable. It is the leading in technology for about almost any physical activity you can think of, swimming, biking, if you're training for a triathlon, if you're running for a marathon, if you're training for competitions with weights or any sport, it actually tracks everything that you set it up to do. And the app is super amazing. The Garmin Connect just provides information to you that is user friendly and can actually be able to detect where you can step up your game, and also give you great health stats from what you are seeing, what your watch is reading in your body, things that you are not conscious of. It's great to have that kind of information so you can make better decisions in the day. I will leave a link in the descriptions below to the D2 Mach 1 Pro, but if you navigate to any watch on that, it helps provide support for the podcast. Thank you, and here's the show.
Another like equation that I like to use is, where does wisdom come from? Or what's the difference between wisdom and experience?
Yeah. That's good.
Like I'm going to pose you the question: what's the difference between wisdom and experience? Are they the same thing? Are they different?
There's got to be some sort of line, but when you think deeply about it, that line might not even really be there. It might just be exactly the same. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like all of these, I mean, I love to ask thought-provoking questions because that's the way that I've been able to change the way I think about things. Like we have deep-seated belief system internally, but we get to decide what we choose to believe and how we choose to perceive things. There's a great quote by Viktor Frankl. He was a psychologist in Auschwitz, that's concentration camps back in the Nazi regime, and he survived. And he wrote a book called A Man's Search for Meaning, and he has a quote that was fairly famous. It really impacted my life, and it was, a man has the ability, or a man can be robbed of anything and everything except one thing: his ability to perceive or choose how he perceives anything in any given moment.
Correct.
So like you can be robbed of, like, people can take everything externally from you, everything. Like people can even starve you, and you can like lose all your fat. Like you can even, you can be being arrested, and like your freedom, like all these different things, but nobody can ever take away your ability to choose how you perceive a situation.
Yeah.
So like you might get dealt a bad hand of cards, but there's only one chance. There's only one way to maximize your chances of winning in life, and that is to play that hand of cards.
Yeah.
Because most people will go through life ignoring, saying, I got dealt a bad hand. I failed this. I failed that. I can't get this job here. I can't do this. I can't do that. Versus understanding that nobody has a clear path. Nobody knows where they're going to end up. I ended up quitting the airlines. I ended up starting First Class Leaders. I took a private jet job, and now I'm trying to build a community around the world to help pilots in the way that I never was. I could not have predicted that.
Right.
But if I had set my goal only on Air Canada as a captain at Air Canada, everything else got shut out, and I didn't see any other opportunities. Versus now, all I'm doing is focusing on the process, and I'm loving every minute of it. It's challenging. It has its roller coaster rides. It's like climbing that mountain.
Yeah.
But it becomes, if you want to learn how to get through the hard, challenging work, you have to learn to focus on the process.
Absolutely. That reminds me a lot of these concepts. So a couple of years ago, I took a course from Tony Robbins to become a strategic intervention coach, where I learned a lot of this emotional intelligence, a lot of the psychological part of what drives us, what causes humans to behave a certain way. And while we were learning more about these concepts, the whole point is you learn about your own behavior as well, and why you behave a certain way and why you think a certain way, and kind of like digging about what causes you to do that. And there's a lot that I associate in between this, that psychology drives a certain degree of leadership, right? Because I believe that leadership is something that you can learn and that you can do. You're not born, you don't necessarily have to be born with it, but understanding certain psychological measures about yourself can allow you to have this potential of just being way more of a leader than you thought you were. Where do you think that balance is in terms of psychology and leadership?
Oh man, it's so intertwined. I think it's everything.
Yeah.
I think those are the conversations that we need to start having more of.
Right.
Because oftentimes we look at psychology or therapy or the brain side of things as this thing that's reserved for people that are diagnosed with illnesses, right?
Sure.
But I mean, why do I go to the gym and exercise? I haven't been diagnosed as obese, right?
Right.
Yet I'm going and taking care of my body, and that's normal. Well, why wouldn't I take care of my brain in the same way? So to go
Exactly.
through your life and to think that your brain doesn't need exercising, I mean, unfortunately, you won't uncover what you're capable of. So if you ask yourself, what am I truly capable of? What is life truly capable of for me? What does it look like? You'll never know unless you start to look inwards at the psychology of how you're programmed, how you're wired. And what
Yeah.
you realize is there's two sides. Number one is you learn to forgive yourself and other people a lot quicker because you realize how wired we are and how programmed we are from the ages of 0 to 6. Like most of your personality and your belief system is formed from the ages of zero to 6, right?
Yeah,
So you
exactly.
can blame your parents all you want, or you can blame the people around you all you want.
Yeah.
The thing is, once you're aware of that fact, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, wow, okay, I didn't know that, and you're now aware of that, you owe it to yourself to do something because you
Yeah.
can change your belief
Exactly.
system. It
Yep.
just takes work. And sometimes it's scary, but remember, we're all on the same page.
In
We're
it.
all
Yeah.
human with that.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're all in it, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It was scary to think about your own when you're diving into these psychological matters, and it's it's nothing like you're doing psychotherapy on yourself. You're learning about, what drives human behavior, right? And then you talk about psychological needs. When you start getting to psychological needs, you start kind of thinking of, well, damn, why do I value this need so highly? What made me value this need so highly? And then what do I do to value this need, right? And then there's positive ways to value that need, negative ways that you can get to valuing that need. It's very, very interesting. So it gets kind of scary when you start thinking, well, I value significance a lot. Well, why do I value significance? Did I not get enough attention when I was a kid? Did I not this? Like now I want that kind of attention. But somebody who did get a lot of attention as a kid and value significance can be, I helped 100 people in 1 month. That's a different type of significance rather than a selfish kind of significance. There's so many examples and so many things. And when you start diving deep into it, it's scary to realize these things. But when you get to the end of the tunnel, you start seeing that light, man, it's wonderful. It's amazing what concepts you have learned about yourself and self realization where you can change your behavior later on. It doesn't happen quickly, but you start recognizing things that can possibly trigger you. You start recognizing things that can possibly cause you to start feeling a certain way. And this isn't just on in your personal life. This is in the flight deck too, because there's a lot of different emotions and different people that we fly with. So that kind of leads me into, asking you, what is the importance of psychological safety, not just in aviation, but in the real world too, outside of the plane?
I mean, yeah, these are great things to be talking about, and I appreciate you having me on the podcast to talk about these because they're life changing.
Yeah.
Psychological safety. I mean, just for anybody who doesn't know, and it's okay, I'll always put my hand up first and say, I didn't know a lot of this stuff up until 5-6 years ago, and even then, it was very difficult because I didn't have any support. I was reading this in books, and I was really trying to challenge everything. And we'll talk about how this all ties back to leadership, but psychological safety is creating an environment where somebody else feels safe enough to speak up and ask any question or say anything without feeling like they're going to be embarrassed or shamed or ridiculed.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're younger and you're trying to date and you're trying to get the nerve to ask that girl out, or that girl trying to get the nerve to ask the guy out, that nerve is happening because we feel like if they say no, we're going to feel shamed. We're going to feel embarrassed. That's psychological safety. It's very powerful.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you this, and you might know it, but do you know what the number one human emotion is that we try to avoid? Has to do with psychological safety.
Is it failure?
No, close. Shame.
Okay.
It's all tied together, right?
Yeah.
But we will do, and I mean, I'm somewhat careful about what I say, but take all my words with a grain of salt. But we will do anything to not feel shame or embarrassment.
Of course.
Until you get to the point where you're aware that when those situations where you're going to feel shame or embarrassment, you're being the victim. You're looking at you. You're selfish. And leadership is about understanding that happens. It's not easy sometimes. Sometimes it's really not easy to push through and ask that girl out, running that risk that you might get shut down.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth it, because when you understand that shame is okay, it's okay to feel that.
Mm-hmm.
But what's not okay is to let it stop you from asking that girl out.
Exactly.
Because every time we do that, what we're telling ourselves is, when I feel this feeling of shame or embarrassment,
I'm not going to do it. Yeah.
I'm not going to do anything.
Exactly.
So now relate that to the flight deck. Relate that to any aspect of your life.
Yeah.
Because it's not normal to grow up and be talking about psychological safety or that feeling of shame.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not taught. And so you go through your life and all of a sudden you stop trying to take risks because you don't want to feel that feeling.
Right.
And you get into the cockpit and somebody says some comment and he laughs, and it sounds like an innocent laugh, but then you just feel like, maybe I just won't say anything else because I don't know how they took it, but now I kind of feel a little embarrassed. And that's, safety is out the window.
Absolutely.
Safety is at risk now. So
yeah, and that ties in to what value or what your need is that you're valuing. So if you stop taking so much risk, you live in a life of comfort, and you do whatever it takes to stay in that comfortable position, because the need for your comfort, you're not for being uncomfortable or for variety, you're not valuing it enough. So you're not taking additional risks. You're not taking all these things. It's the same example as with asking a girl out or a guy out, and it's, what, are you not going to do it again? So you're just going to live in comfort of never asking someone else out. You eventually get past that, right? It's not easy, but there it goes. The valuing of psychological needs, comfort, variety, significance, love, contribution. Those are the attributes of psychological needs that ties into what we're talking about here.
Yeah, the word comfort is one that we have to be careful. One of the things I've always done for myself, which has really helped me, is I just challenge every word internally, and I'm doing it a little bit more externally now.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of comfort, one thing that you have to understand, people have to understand, if you're listening to this, I'm challenging you to think about this idea of comfort, because I've said exactly what you just said to certain people, and they're like, yeah, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with just making X amount of money or just being alone or this. The problem is that, let's say it's comfortable not going to the gym. It's comfortable not exercising, right? It's easy. It's so comfortable laying on a couch. So anything that you feel is comfortable right now and you want to stay in it, remember that at some point in your life, it will not be comfortable anymore.
Yeah.
And so as humans, we seek short-term gratification. We're always looking for that short-term high. What will get me the quickest results in the shortest amount of time?
Yep.
The worst part about that is the long-term. We just doesn't, you're a smoker and you don't quit smoking until you get lung cancer and the doctor tells you to quit smoking, right? Right. I know that's an extreme example, but even on the smallest levels. And I mean, you're into fitness. I am too. One of the hardest things about fitness is you have to rewire your belief system.
Yeah.
And that leads me back to one of the things we were talking about earlier. But do you know what the number one thing is to motivate somebody? What's the most important aspect of motivation when it comes to, you can call it leadership if you want. How do you motivate somebody? Or how are you motivated yourself?
For me, for myself and my personal experience, you normally turn to what fulfills me in fitness. For example, let's just say, if my mind is always thinking, I want to be somebody that's athletic. I want to be someone who can do sports. I can, be in martial arts and be able to move the way I want to move, even though that doesn't mean that I have to be super strong. But I'll do whatever it takes for me to have the balance of flexibility, mobility, strength, and everything to be able to move the way I want to, because that makes me feel good. That leads me to structuring exercises, workouts, disciplines, routines, etc.
So why do you want to feel good? Why do you want to be mobile? Like, what is it about being immobile in life that is good?
I just think it's, for me, I think it's just that you are not going to have these tweaks and things like, or the tweaks and pains are going to be less and less and less. And that for me, when I had lower back pain, gave me so much psychological stress besides physical. It was something
Yeah.
that just like burned me, man. I couldn't think like very well when I was having a little bit of pain. It took so much energy from me, and I just didn't want to feel that way.
Perfect. And then you have the ability to play with your like girlfriend, wife. I don't know if
Wife,
you're
yeah, yeah,
married or not.
yeah,
Um, play with, hang with your wife, kids, if
right,
that's in the, if that's in the future, being able to be independent, do
right,
your own things, pick up something off the floor when you're 80 years old, right?
yeah,
Like, so the point there is you were saying before, you were talking about asking why you do something. The most powerful, the most impactful thing that you could ever do to yourself is ask yourself why.
hmm,
And I don't know if it's I can't remember the book, but there's a book that talks about the 7 levels of why.
yes, it's
So you should be able
great.
to ask yourself why 7 different times, and eventually you'll get to the real reason why
Oh yeah,
you are trying to do something. And most people don't get past level 1 or level 2.
right,
And so what happens is we have these surface level whys, and they're not powerful enough.
hmm,
But if I close my eyes, even do it right now, I can physically feel my body starting. I'll cry, I will shake, because I am so, like, I envision being 127 years old before I die. That's
hmm,
my goal.
hmm,
And I envision the benchmark at 100 years old, and I think to myself, man, what would it be like if I couldn't golf and I couldn't hike? Like, dude, it
yeah,
just makes me sad thinking about it. If I couldn't
yeah,
take care of the people around me. And that is such a powerful motivator. And that's what gets me up in the morning to go do the thing that's hard,
wow,
because I think about that why.
yeah,
So when you're talking about leadership, leaders understand that the most powerful motivator is why. And if you help yourself, number
hmm,
one, learn what your why is. Like, my why is different than your why, but we're all kind of the same. Like, we're all seeking connection and love and
exactly,
value, right?
yeah,
But understanding our why is how we can navigate our lives with more motivation and more effectiveness, and
yeah.
less be okay with that little bit less comfort, so that we are more comfortable throughout our life.
Yeah. No, I think that's perfectly said. I've heard the seven levels of why, and like you, man, that when I dove deep and I got to level 5, you have to get through that emotional barrier, because if you don't let yourself get through that emotional barrier, you're never going to get to level 6. I mean, it's rare that people get to level 7, but man, you really truly find your why, and then
Hmm.
you kind of work your way back up the ladder as to, oh, if I'm going to change a behavior or figure out why I behave a certain way because of these 7 levels of why, you start your way backwards, and you can change what was up in that ladder. And it's really interesting, but it takes time, and you have to be super the best and the most effective part about that exercise. You have to be very honest with yourself. You can't bullshit your way through it. You can't just do a cookie cutter, like you mentioned, surface level why. No, it has to be deep. It has to be deep, and that's hard to get to. It's part of that emotional intelligence as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and if I could say anything to anybody, if you want advice on how to get there, it's seek help, seek mentorship,
Hmm.
seek. I mean, I'm a big advocate for therapy, coaching, mentorship,
Yeah,
all of the above,
yeah,
because a lot of these, therapy, for an example, gets a bad reputation because, again, it's for people who are clinically diagnosed. I'm like, well, wouldn't you want to make sure that you're not going to get clinically diagnosed someday by being proactive? So when I went
exactly.
to therapy for the first time, he's like, why are you here? And I said, well, because I don't know what I don't know. And I figured you could probably help me unpack some stuff that I don't know about myself. Right.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I'm just doing it proactively. And of course, we unpacked some of the levels of why, or some of the reasons I think a certain way. And the more you can unpack that and get to the root cause of why you think a certain way, or why your beliefs a certain way, or why you're not motivated, any of those things, the easier it is to actually change those behaviors.
Yeah.
And then one of my favorite things that started happening to me personally was, uh, after like maybe 2-3 years of personal development, really getting deep and looking inwards, people started actually telling me, and I actually had several scenarios. They would actually tell me, like, at the golf course once, I was golfing with this person, and they're like, something new, like something weird about you, Kyle. Like, what's going on? And I'm like, and this is like a stranger that I've golfed with maybe a few times before. And he's like, yeah, something's different. Like, you're different. I'm like, in a good way, bad way? And he's like, really good way. He's like, don't take this the wrong way. And I've had a few people say this to me, and I love it. Don't take this the wrong way. But you actually you weren't very fun to be around a few years ago.
Wow.
And I said to myself, I said two things. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Because that just told me two things. Number one, he felt safe enough to say that, which is that psychological safety.
100%.
And number two, is that means I'm growing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just realized that if I'm not, I don't know if embarrassed is the right word, but if I can't look back a day, a week, a year and say, okay, how am I better than I was last year? If I can't answer that question, then I'm not growing.
Exactly.
And that's not good. And if you're in any if you want to be a more positive leader, a more positive influence on the people around you, you have to be able to answer that question on a daily basis. Yeah. And it can be simple. It could be, I read this quote, I listened to this podcast, I learned this new concept, I thought about my why. It can be very, very, very simple. And what happens then when you do that, you're focusing on the gains. And you're going to switch that mentality to, hey, how am I better than yesterday? 1%. How am I 1% better than yesterday? If you can answer that question every day, watch the momentum in your life change.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible, man. And people can feel, I guess it's like that external vibe that or that energy that you're putting out there, right? Like you mentioned, he felt safe enough to say that, which is awesome. But there is that energy, man, that people emit when you're feeling a certain way. And it's true. And this is in a golf course, open area. There's probably more people around, which they feel that same energy. Now let's close that area up and put ourselves in a flight deck where the only person next to you is less than 6 feet away. That same energy is felt probably even stronger, right? And I think that emotional intelligence and that leadership is so important and so crucial, because what you said earlier in the podcast today is for someone to feel safe enough to be able to mention something about whatever they're going through right now, right? A certain phase of flight or anything. But that is critical when it gets to decision making. That is critical when it gets to crew resource management. And shame is something that you mentioned that, yes, people are most afraid of that, feeling that. And if I can give a quick example, is there's a lot of young captains taking the opportunity, or a lot of young first officers taking the opportunity to be captains. And you often fly with first officers that have more experience than you. And just because you're captain does not mean that leadership is, we're going to do this and I have to have like the all the knowledge to impress and be, just make this flight go great. No, that's so much pressure that you put on yourself. And shame is felt when a different pilot tells you, hey, we're not doing this correctly, or maybe we should do this instead of that. And they have a different way of thinking, and it could be better than what you're planning on doing, even if someone has less experience than you. But you want to make that environment so that the other pilot can say something and be like, oh, okay, you took in my idea. Maybe it wasn't as great as I thought it was, but we at least talked about it, right? That's super, super important. And I think that's one of the key things about first-class leaders.
I mean, yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head. The most impactful thing you can do as a leader is think about the other person. So if you want to, talking about psychological safety, let's say we're going to go back to the dating thing. I don't know why this is what I honestly,
it's just for today. That's what it is.
It's actually what I always, it was one of my challenges growing up. Like I struggled with that. I was always very good at pushing through on everything challenging in my life. Dating was one that I was kind of ignorant, a little arrogant, trying to get through that fear. But think of, if you switch your mentality, this is where I've switched my mentality and what I believe. So going from thinking, oh, I might feel shame or embarrassment or I might get shut down, or I might fail, or I might this, or I might that. that is a victim mentality. If you want to be a leader, it's just a simple shift in your focus. Think about the other person. What if that girl, what if I'm the perfect guy for that girl? What if I'm the perfect what if I bring a lot of joy and love into their lives? What if I, what if so it's like, how do I shift? So like if you're flying with another pilot and they have a lot more experience, it's like, hey, what if I get them to share more of their experience? How would they feel
Right.
in any given situation? Less like, oh, well, if he answers the question and I don't, I'm going to feel shame because I should know because I'm the captain and he's
Right.
not. Leadership is about saying, no, build up that other person.
Yeah.
Like everybody wants to be the one that talks, right? We
Yeah.
want to be the
Yeah, for
ones
sure.
that because we think we can talk our value. And it's really hard, and I still struggle with it. But your value does not come from talking. Your value comes from listening and action.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, sure, you might get some value from hearing our words, but if I'm not sharing it with some of my background, some of my stories, and letting you know it comes from a position of struggle and challenge, you might just sit here listening to this podcast being like, what is this guy? I know he's just trying to tell me what to do. Right?
Yeah.
So leadership is, again, like understanding, thinking about the other person and trying to help build them up and get them to open up, and creating that safe space is a huge aspect of being able to do that. Best thing you can do in aviation, in my opinion, is learn about psychological safety, and then understand, literally, you can never, it's like hard to do 100% because any given situation is different. Leadership is an art. It's not a perfection. How I create psychological safety with you over this podcast, or if we're in person, or if we're in the flight deck, is always going to be different. Depends on your mood, depends on my mood. It's so many factors.
Right.
So realize that it's difficult and it's not a perfect science, but if you start progressing towards opening up that space, you'll realize that to do it, you have to stop talking a lot. You have to ask a lot more questions, and you have to be very vulnerable.
Absolutely. And everything that you mentioned is exactly what I just experienced in 2 different trips. And I will say that whenever I was a first officer and a captain allowed me that space to be able to speak pretty well in terms of anything in the flight deck, it felt really great that someone was willing to take my opinion, whether it was right or wrong, or whether it was a good idea or not. If it got shut down, cool. Maybe there's something I didn't notice about it. But now as a captain, I flew with a first officer who was a 20-year captain out of Yanka, and he had just come here. So much more experience than me. Heavy flying, narrow body flying, everything. And that whole safe space, communication between him and I was awesome. He obviously knew a lot more than me. And of course, you're in the left seat, and there's that possibility that you might feel ashamed that, somebody else knows more than you because you're the captain. And, that is not part of the safe space. The next trip later, and fantastic person, by the way, I loved flying with him. But the next trip, I had someone who was completely the opposite. And he also had some experience too, but all he did was talk too much. And this is part of the leadership stuff where you don't shut someone down from talking too much, but you kind of start guiding the environment as to, let's slow down in how much we're talking. Let's get to know a little bit about each other first, and what we value, because that's going to lead up as soon as we start pushing back. If you're talking this much and you're getting me we're going to miss radio calls, you're going to let's just slow it down, right? So 2 different things in the leadership is to be able to amend to each person that you're flying with, which is, I think, is really fantastic. But I personally think that that's a whole nother topic that we should probably leave for another episode. I think we've covered so many great topics so far, and I am very excited that, Kyle, we're going to be doing at least 2 more episodes together talking about so many of these different subjects. So the first class leaders, there's a website that people can go to, right? Can you please share that with the audience?
Yeah, and just to close out your comment there, just for maybe some preparation for the next episode, if you are listening, we at First Class Leaders have a solution to navigating different personalities. Like we use a behavioral assessment tool, and we'll get into that and why it's so effective. So just know that right now in aviation, communication, we're basically told in CRM who to be. We're supposed to be a good communicator, good at conflict resolution, good at all these different things, but nobody teaches us really how, because it's a very individualized approach. We're all unique.
Right.
So it's not, I can't teach you, right? Because you and I look at things differently. So what we do is we equip people with a tool that does this really, really effectively based upon your inputs. But we can get into that next episode. So our website is firstclassleaders.com or .ca, but .com. And just how it sounds, all one word, firstclassleaders.com. You can check us out. We got a advanced leadership workshop where we use this behavioral assessment tool. It's getting amazing feedback, amazing results, starting to get it into more flight schools. We use it as a command upgrade program for different companies. Any pilot, honestly, if you got your private pilot's license and you are a pilot in command of an aircraft, then you owe it to yourself to learn more about leadership. And then we have the Pilot Leadership Network, which is the other side of First Class Leaders. You can find it all through the website. But the Pilot Leadership Network is basically what it sounds like: a bunch of pilots. We're all committed to being better leaders, growth, and it's a safe environment because anybody who joins the network is saying to themselves and saying to everybody else, hey, I'm here to grow. And that makes a big impact on when you're trying to work through a lot of this stuff. So
yeah, amazing, man. This is really great, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I'm really looking forward for the next episodes where we get to talk a lot more about these leadership skills. And man, I think so many people are going to learn so much. I'm learning, you're learning about everything, something new every day. We all do, and that's the beauty of just the human brain and how it works and how we develop ourselves. Kyle, thank you so much, man, for your time today, and I can't wait until we chat in the next episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I look forward to the next episode as well.
Okay. All right, man. See ya.